His mother mocked our son at Thanksgiving. So my husband burned their entire empire to the ground, and then Philadelphia's streets were still wrapped in morning mist, the faint glow of the streetlights barely cutting through the fog, as I stood in my bakery, carefully rolling out fresh dough for the day's pastries. Through the large front window, I could see the city beginning to stir. Early commuters walking briskly down the sidewalks, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air, bundled in heavy coats against the approaching chill of late November. The smell of butter and cinnamon filled the shop, wrapping me in the familiar comfort of my morning routine, grounding me before the day truly began. I had just finished setting aside the first tray of croissants to proof when I heard the small, eager voice behind me, filled with excitement and pride, interrupting my quiet concentration. I turned to see my 10-year-old son, Leo, standing near the counter, his hands slightly sticky with frosting, carefully presenting a cupcake he had decorated all by himself. His face, lit up with pure joy, made me momentarily forget all the stress I had been carrying, reminding me of the simple happiness that came with creating something with your own hands. Saturday mornings had become a tradition between us, a small pocket of time where it was just the two of us in the kitchen, free from distractions, free from the outside world. My husband, Nathan, had already left for another one of his endless client meetings, his role as a top sales executive demanding more of his time than either of us liked. His absence had become something of an expectation, his dedication to work pulling him away even on weekends. But I had long learned to navigate around the spaces he left behind, filling them with moments like this, moments that belonged only to me and my son. Leo's love for baking had grown alongside my own, his curiosity leading him to pull up a stool beside me after school, watching intently as I shaped dough, piped cream, or carefully layered delicate sheets of pastry. At his last parent-teacher conference, he had confidently stood in front of the class and announced that he wanted to be a pastry chef when he grew up, proudly declaring to the room that he wanted to be just like his mom. His teacher had later told me that he was a child who brought warmth to those around him, a child who made others feel safe, a child who had a way of pulling people together. The bakery had been busier than ever since an article in a prominent Philadelphia magazine had named it one of the best bakeries in the city, the unexpected recognition bringing in an overwhelming number of new customers eager to try our famous pastries. That morning, one of my employees, Jennifer, had peeked into the kitchen with an excited grin, reporting that half of the croissants had sold out within the first hour, a clear sign that we were experiencing another record-breaking weekend. I had built this place from nothing, working tirelessly for years to carve out a name for myself in an industry that rarely made space for people like me, pushing forward despite the obstacles, despite the doubt, despite the voices that had once told me that someone from my background had no place in a world like this. Growing up in a struggling household in Philadelphia's South Side, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table, I had learned early on that dreams came at a cost, that nothing worth having was ever given freely. I had earned a scholarship to one of the best pastry schools in the country, worked long hours as an apprentice in hotel kitchens where no one bothered to learn my name, fought my way through dismissive glances and condescending remarks, until finally, I had a place to call my own. Nathan's world had always been the complete opposite of mine, his childhood spent in the wealthiest neighborhoods, his family deeply entrenched in Philadelphia's elite social circles, his future paved with connections and expectations. When he chose me, when he married me despite his mother's vehement disapproval, he had unknowingly set off a battle that had never truly ended, a battle that had simmered beneath the surface of our lives for over a decade. Judith, his mother, had never once accepted me, had never once made an attempt to hide her disdain, had never once allowed me to forget that in her eyes, I was an outsider. On the day Nathan told her we were engaged, she had stared at him in cold disbelief, her voice sharp with fury as she declared that he was throwing away his future, that he was disgracing the family, that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. On our wedding day, she had sat stiffly in the front row, her expression unreadable, barely speaking to me, barely acknowledging my presence, making it abundantly clear that she had only attended out of obligation. Even after Leo was born, she had made no effort to soften, treating him with the same cold indifference she reserved for me, lavishing her other grandchildren with expensive gifts while barely acknowledging his birthdays. When we had invited her to his 10th birthday party last month, hoping that maybe, just maybe, things had changed, she hadn't even bothered to show up, making it clear that he was no more worthy of her affection than I had ever been. Then, yesterday, the invitation had arrived, the same invitation that came every year, the same invitation that filled our house with tension every November, the same invitation that neither of us knew how to answer. The Turner family's Thanksgiving dinner was an event that held more weight than any holiday should, an evening where reputations mattered more than gratitude, where appearances were more important than sincerity, where every movement, every word, every interaction was carefully observed, analyzed, and judged. Every year, I told myself I wouldn't go, that I had no reason to subject myself to another evening of forced smiles and barely concealed insults, that I had no reason to place myself in a room full of people who saw me as nothing more than an unwelcome guest in their world. But this year was different. This year, when I looked across the dinner table, when I saw Leo's hopeful face, when I heard the quiet plea in his voice as he said he wanted to spend Thanksgiving with his grandmother, I found myself hesitating. Nathan, who had spent years trying to shield me from his family's cruelty, who had spent years learning when to fight and when to let things go, had already told me we didn't have to go, had already told me that no one would blame me for saying no. But as much as I wanted to listen to him, as much as I wanted to protect myself from another evening of biting remarks and cold glances, I couldn't ignore the quiet hope in my son's eyes. So, against my better judgment, against every warning in my gut, against every past experience that told me this was a mistake, I took a breath, forced a smile, and nodded. "We'll go." The cold November wind cut through the streets as we drove toward the Turner estate, the sky already darkening despite the early hour, the heavy clouds hanging low as if warning me of what was to come. In the back seat, Leo sat quietly, fidgeting with the silver pin on his new navy suit, his small hands carefully adjusting the knot of his light blue tie, his usual excitement dampened by the unfamiliar weight of anticipation. I watched his reflection in the rearview mirror, the flickering streetlights casting shifting shadows across his face, his expression caught somewhere between nerves and hope, a silent battle he wasn't quite old enough to understand. Nathan's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, his knuckles slightly white from the pressure, his focus fixed straight ahead as we passed row after row of grand estates, each one a symbol of old money and inherited power. Neither of us had spoken much since we left the house, both knowing that no amount of conversation could change what awaited us at the end of this road, both knowing that no carefully chosen words could soften the reality of what this night would become. The Turner estate stood at the end of a long, winding driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, the towering iron gates parting silently as we approached, as if swallowing us whole. The mansion loomed before us, its red brick facade gleaming under the glow of the entrance lights, the elegant arching windows reflecting the flickering flames of candlelit chandeliers inside, the entire place exuding an air of cold perfection. Several luxury cars were already parked neatly in the circular driveway, sleek black Bentleys, shining silver Mercedes, and unmistakable Rolls-Royce, each one a quiet reminder of the wealth and status that had always defined this family. The moment we stepped inside, warmth enveloped us, the rich aroma of roasting turkey and spiced cider filling the air, the sound of polite laughter and crystal glasses clinking together carrying through the grand hall. The chandeliers overhead bathed everything in a golden glow, illuminating the pristine white marble floors, the towering floral arrangements, the perfectly curated holiday decor that made the entire scene look like something out of an overpriced magazine spread. The maids moved quickly and silently around the house, their uniforms crisp, their expressions neutral, their presence barely acknowledged by the guests who had already begun gathering in the massive dining room. Nathan's father, Robert, was the first to greet us, his usual gentle smile in place, his voice warm as he reached out to pat Leo on the head, his attempt at normalcy almost convincing. Of all the members of this family, Robert was the only one who had ever made an effort to bridge the gap between us, the only one who had ever treated me with anything resembling kindness, the only one who had ever seemed to recognize how much damage had been done. Around us, relatives glanced up from their conversations, some offering polite nods, others watching with mild curiosity, all careful to keep their reactions subdued, as if any display of emotion might disrupt the illusion of civility they had all agreed to maintain. For the first half hour, everything remained as expected, the usual pleasantries exchanged, the usual careful small talk weaving through the air, the usual routine of pretending that this was just another family gathering instead of a carefully orchestrated performance. Leo had quickly fallen in with a group of his cousins, his initial nerves fading as he became absorbed in their quiet chatter, his laughter occasionally rising above the hum of conversation, his small frame standing slightly taller with the comfort of belonging. But then the room shifted. The sharp click of heels against marble signaled her arrival before I even turned to look, the sound of careful, deliberate steps echoing through the dining room, the room instinctively quieting in response. Judith descended the grand staircase with the same calculated elegance she carried everywhere, her emerald green dress sweeping against the floor, her diamond necklace catching the light, her entire presence demanding attention without a single word spoken. The expression she wore was the one she had perfected over years, cool, practiced, just warm enough to maintain appearances, just distant enough to remind me exactly where I stood. "Rachel, what a lovely blouse," she said smoothly, her lips curving into something that almost resembled a smile, her tone dripping with just enough condescension to make it clear that it wasn't a compliment. I nodded slightly, refusing to take the bait, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted, refusing to let her turn this into another one of her carefully disguised insults disguised as pleasantries. The maids moved to direct everyone to their assigned seats, the long dining table gleaming under the candlelight, the heavy silverware polished to perfection, the delicate china patterned with gold filigree, the crystal glasses placed with precision. The room itself was a masterpiece of quiet opulence, every detail carefully curated, every element serving as a silent reminder of the wealth and legacy that this family so desperately clung to. But as I reached for Leo's chair, my breath caught, my entire body going still, my pulse roaring in my ears. In place of the silver service plate that sat at every other seat, in place of the neatly folded linen napkin, in place of the carefully arranged utensils, there sat a single, stainless steel dog bowl, the word puppy engraved along the edge, the contents filled with dry, brown kibble. A sickening silence fell over the room. Somewhere to my left, a cousin let out a barely audible gasp. A sharp inhale quickly swallowed back, their wide eyes darting between me and the scene before them. An uncle cleared his throat, his discomfort evident, shifting slightly in his chair as if debating whether or not to say something, his gaze flicking toward Judith before quickly lowering. Across the table, an older aunt turned her face away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression carefully neutral, her silence speaking louder than any words ever could. Leo's small fingers gripped the sleeve of my blouse, his hand tightening slightly, his entire body stiffening as his gaze remained locked on the bowl in front of him, the reality of what was happening settling in far too quickly. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his breathing change, could feel the way his chest rose and fell just a little too fast, could feel the way he was trying so desperately to hold himself together. Nathan's voice, low and furious, broke through the suffocating quiet, his entire body radiating barely controlled rage as he turned toward his mother, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw locked so tightly I thought he might shatter his own teeth. What the hell is the meaning of this? Judith didn't even flinch. Raising her glass slowly, her fingers wrapped delicately around the stem, she took a measured sip of her wine, her expression calm, her smile faint, her tone as light as if she were commenting on the weather. Why would a child of slum-raised parents need fine dining? The words, so casually cruel, so effortlessly venomous, hung in the air like poison, seeping into every corner of the room, staining everything they touched. Robert coughed violently, nearly knocking over his drink, his face paling as he registered the weight of what had just been said, his usual calm cracking under the pressure of the moment. A maid, standing near the doorway, accidentally dropped a glass, the sharp sound of shattering crystal piercing through the suffocating silence, the scattered shards reflecting the flickering candlelight like tiny, broken stars. Leo's lip trembled, his eyes glistening as he blinked rapidly, his small body shaking as he fought to keep his emotions in check, as he fought to swallow the hurt, as he fought to stay composed in the face of something no child should ever have to endure. And that was when something inside me broke. The weight of the silence pressed down on my chest, the suffocating tension wrapping around me as I stared at the silver dog bowl, the engraved word mocking me, searing itself into my mind as if branded there permanently. My fingers curled into the fabric of my dress, my nails digging into my palms as I fought against the flood of emotions threatening to rise to the surface, my pulse roaring in my ears, my breath unsteady as I forced myself to look at my son. Leo stood frozen beside me, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with the uneven rhythm of someone desperately trying to hold back tears, someone who had just learned a lesson far too cruel for his young age. He had spent weeks looking forward to tonight, had spent the entire car ride hoping for something that never had a chance of happening, had convinced himself that this family could be something other than what it had always been. Nathan's chair scraped against the floor as he shoved it back, his movements stiff with fury, his entire body radiating a barely controlled rage that made the air around us feel like it had dropped in temperature. His voice, low and sharp enough to cut through steel, sent a chill down my spine as he turned to his mother, his hands pressing against the edge of the table, as if holding himself in place was the only thing keeping him from shattering the fragile illusion of civility that Judith still pretended existed. You've humiliated my son, you've disrespected my wife, and you sit there drinking your wine like this is just another evening in your perfectly curated world. Judith barely spared him a glance, her fingers gracefully swirling the deep red liquid in her glass, her expression unchanged, her lips curling slightly, as if she found his anger amusing, as if his outrage was nothing more than an inconvenience to be ignored. The room remained deathly still, the tension thick enough to choke on, the other guests watching without speaking, too cowardly to interfere, too complicit to look away. Robert, his usual calm nowhere to be found, pressed a shaking hand against his forehead, his mouth opening as if to say something, but the words never came, his horror evident in the tight lines of his face, in the way his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his wife's cruelty. Somewhere to my left, a cousin let out a nervous cough, the sound too loud, too sharp against the deafening silence. His discomfort clear in the way, he kept his eyes trained on the table, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. I felt Leo's hand tighten around mine, his grip so small, so fragile, his entire body trembling as he fought against the humiliation, as he struggled to understand why his own grandmother had just reduced him to something less than human. I had spent years swallowing every insult, had spent years ignoring the pointed remarks, had spent years pretending that her disdain didn't touch me, had spent years telling myself that it wasn't worth the fight. But this wasn't about me anymore. I pushed my chair back, the sound slicing through the quiet, the movement slow, deliberate, my spine straightening as I looked around the table, my gaze lingering on each of the people who had sat here in silence, who had let this happen, who had let their fear of Judith's disapproval outweigh their basic sense of decency. My voice, steady despite the storm raging inside of me, broke the stillness, cutting through the heavy air like the sharp edge of a knife, forcing every single person in that room to hear me. I will not let my son sit at a table where he is treated like an animal, where he is made to feel like he is less than any of you. I have endured your insults. I have tolerated your cruelty. I have allowed you to treat me like I do not belong. but I will not stand here and watch you do the same to my child." Judith arched an eyebrow, her expression cool, detached, her fingers still resting lightly on the stem of her wine glass. Her lack of reaction infuriating in a way that made my stomach twist. The flickering candlelight reflected in her diamond necklace, the shimmer of wealth and power draped around her like armor. But I saw through it now, saw through the carefully crafted facade, saw through the illusion she had spent decades maintaining. Nathan, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white, exhaled sharply before nodding once, the tension in his posture shifting as he made his decision, as he let go of the last thread binding him to the family he had once been willing to defend. Without another word, he turned toward Leo, placing a firm but gentle hand on our son's shoulder, his expression softening for the first time that evening as he leaned down just enough to meet his eyes. "We're leaving," Nathan said quietly, his voice no longer sharp with anger, but steady with resolve, the finality in his words sending another ripple of shock through the already stunned room. Leo, still trembling, swallowed hard before nodding, his small fingers gripping my hand with renewed strength, his trust in us, his faith in the people who truly loved him, holding him together as we turned away from the table, from the family that had never truly been ours. The sound of our footsteps echoed across the marble floors as we walked toward the entrance, the cold air rushing in as the doors opened before us, the sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the dining room filling my lungs, making it easier to breathe, making it easier to walk away. Behind us, the quiet murmurs of the guests began to rise, voices overlapping, hurried whispers blending together, the sound of breaking glass and hushed arguments filtering through the open doorway. Robert's voice, uncharacteristically loud, cracked through the chaos, his words sharp with something that sounded like anger, like regret, like disbelief at what his wife had just done. But I didn't turn around. I didn't stop walking. I didn't let myself care. As we reached the car, I opened the back door for Leo, my hand steady as I helped him inside, my movements careful, gentle, my heart breaking at the way his shoulders hunched slightly, at the way he stared down at his lap, at the way he refused to meet my eyes. Nathan's breathing was still uneven, his jaw still tight, his body still vibrating with rage as he slid into the driver's seat, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard that I thought it might snap beneath the pressure. The silence in the car was thick, heavy, suffocating, the only sound the low hum of the engine as we pulled away from the estate, the Turner mansion growing smaller in the rearview mirror, its grand facade nothing more than a hollow monument to a family I no longer considered my own. Leo remained quiet in the back seat, his reflection visible in the side window, the passing streetlights casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across his face, his features unreadable, his expression carefully guarded. I wanted to say something, wanted to reach back and hold his hand, wanted to tell him that none of this was his fault, that he was perfect exactly as he was, that his grandmother's cruelty said nothing about him and everything about her. But I also knew that nothing I said could take away what had happened tonight, that no words could erase the memory of that dog bowl sitting in front of him, that no reassurance could undo the damage that had already been done. So instead, I reached across the center console, my fingers finding Nathan's, my grip firm, steady, unwavering, the silent promise passing between us stronger than anything that could have been spoken. Whatever came next, whatever fallout awaited us, whatever consequences followed this night, we would face them together. The car ride home remained shrouded in silence, the city lights flickering through the windshield as we weaved through the streets, each passing block taking us further from the Turner estate and the poison it held within its walls. Leo sat curled in the back seat, his small hands clasped tightly together in his lap, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the blurred scenery pass by with an expression too heavy for a child who had only just turned 10. Every now and then, I saw his reflection shift slightly, his lip pressing together as if he were trying to swallow down whatever emotions still threatened to surface, as if he were willing himself to be stronger than any 10-year-old should ever have to be. Nathan's grip on the steering wheel never loosened, his fingers still curled with barely contained rage, his breathing still uneven despite the distance we had already put between us and the place that had once been his childhood home. He had spent years tolerating his mother's condescension, years brushing off her sharp-edged words, years swallowing his pride for the sake of maintaining some semblance of family. But tonight had severed whatever remained of that fragile connection. I could feel the weight of his anger pressing against the air between us, unspoken but undeniable, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed the moment we were behind closed doors. The moment we pulled into our driveway, the tension inside the car became almost unbearable, the quiet stretching too thin, the silence no longer offering comfort but suffocating in its intensity. I turned to Leo, my hands reaching out to gently touch his shoulder, my fingers careful as if I were handling something delicate, something breakable, something that had already been cracked but not yet shattered. "Let's get you inside, sweetheart," I murmured softly, my voice deliberately calm, deliberately steady, deliberately warm, refusing to let what had happened tonight be the last thing he felt before falling asleep. Leo nodded once, the movement small, hesitant, his body still stiff as he unbuckled his seatbelt, his shoulders tense as he stepped out of the car, his feet moving slower than usual as he followed me toward the house. The warmth inside should have been a relief after the bitter cold, but even with the familiar scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, the house still felt heavier than usual, the weight of the evening lingering in every shadow, settling into every corner. I guided Leo toward the bathroom, my hands working gently to help him out of his suit, my fingers brushing against the fine fabric that had once symbolized excitement. Now a reminder of disappointment, now a reminder of humiliation, now a reminder of a lesson no child should have to learn so cruelly. He didn't speak as I ran the bath, the warm steam curling into the air, the scent of lavender filling the room as I crouched beside him, carefully washing the last remnants of the night from his skin, carefully trying to undo the damage that had already been done. The silence stretched between us, but I could feel the way his small body trembled slightly beneath my touch, could see the way his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the tub, could hear the way his breathing hitched slightly, uneven and fragile. I wanted to tell him that his grandmother's cruelty was not a reflection of him, that her venom was something born from her own bitterness, her own emptiness, her own failure to see the worth in anything that didn't fit into the pristine, soulless world she had built around herself. But instead, I simply ran my fingers through his damp curls, whispering quiet reassurances, whispering soft promises, whispering the only truth that mattered, that he was loved, that he was cherished, that nothing she had said or done would ever change that. By the time I tucked him into bed, his eyes were heavy with exhaustion, his small body sinking into the warmth of the blankets, his breaths finally steadying, the last traces of tension slowly unraveling from his frame. As I brushed a final kiss against his forehead, I heard his voice, quiet and fragile, barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to get along with Grandma." The ache in my chest became unbearable, my hands tightening into fists at my sides, my nails digging into my skin as I forced myself to stay composed, as I forced myself to keep my voice steady when I answered. "You did nothing wrong, my love," I whispered, my fingers brushing against his cheek, my touch gentle, my words firm, refusing to let the weight of tonight settle onto his small shoulders. His eyelids fluttered closed, his breathing slow and deep, the exhaustion finally pulling him under, his body finally surrendering to sleep, but the weight that had settled onto my chest refused to fade, refused to ease, refused to let me go. I stood there for a long moment, watching him, listening to the rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing, memorizing the way his face softened in sleep, memorizing the way the tension melted away in the safety of his dreams. By the time I stepped out of his room and closed the door behind me, I found Nathan standing in the living room, his back tense, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his entire body radiating a fury that I had never seen in him before. The scattered documents on the coffee table, the phone still clutched in his grip, the barely restrained tremor in his fingers, all told me exactly what had happened the moment I had put Leo to bed. I will never forgive that woman, Nathan said, his voice low, raw, vibrating with barely contained rage, his entire body wound so tightly it looked as if he might snap. I don't care what it costs me. I don't care what it means for the company. I don't care about anything else. I am done with her. I didn't try to stop him when he raised his phone to his ear, his jaw clenched, his breath unsteady. The fury in his expression something I had never witnessed before, something sharper, something colder, something final. The ringing on the other end felt unbearably loud in the silence, the seconds stretching endlessly before the call connected, before Judith's voice, smooth and controlled as always, drifted through the speaker. You thought it was a joke? Nathan's voice, dangerously calm, dangerously steady, sent a chill through the room, his fingers tightening around the phone, his entire body rigid with fury. You thought humiliating my son at a table full of our family was something to laugh about. Judith's response, quiet and dismissive, was cut off as Nathan's voice rose, the controlled fury snapping as he let out a sharp breath, his patience finally shattering. I hope you enjoyed your last Thanksgiving with us, because you will never see my son again. You will never step foot in my home again. And, since you're so convinced that bloodlines matter more than decency, you can explain to the rest of the board why I'm walking away from the company tomorrow. You don't own me, and you don't own my family. You never will. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching for a moment too long, the weight of his words settling into the space between them, settling into the space between all of us. Judith's voice, still perfectly controlled, still unwilling to acknowledge the damage she had done, carried a sharp edge, a final warning, a desperate attempt to maintain control. But it didn't matter anymore. Nathan hung up, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the phone, his chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths, his decision sealed, his future no longer tied to a family that had never truly been his. He turned to me, his gaze searching, his expression raw, his voice quieter now, softer, filled with something closer to exhaustion than rage. I should have left them behind a long time ago. I reached for him, my fingers wrapping around his, my grip firm, unwavering, the silent understanding passing between us stronger than anything that had ever tied us to that family. We're free now, I whispered, my voice steady, my conviction unshaken, and we are never looking back. The morning after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, refusing to dissipate even as the sun streamed through the windows of our home. The quiet hum of the coffee machine filled the kitchen, the rhythmic sound of the dripping liquid the only noise breaking the silence as I stood by the counter, gripping the warm ceramic mug in my hands, my fingers curled tightly around the smooth surface as if holding onto it would somehow steady me. Nathan sat at the dining table, his laptop open in front of him, his phone lighting up with a constant stream of messages, the fallout from his resignation already beginning to ripple through the company. The night before, after his final conversation with his mother, he had sent out an official notice to the board, making it clear that he was stepping down effective immediately, severing himself entirely from Turner Realty and everything it stood for. It hadn't taken long for the news to spread through the ranks, and by the time we had finally gone to bed, his phone had been vibrating nonstop with calls from colleagues, clients, and employees who had been blindsided by his sudden departure. Some of them had pleaded with him to reconsider, telling him that walking away from a company he had helped build would be throwing away everything he had worked for, while others had quietly admitted that they understood, that they respected his decision, that they wished they had the courage to do the same. But the most surprising messages had come from employees who had spent years enduring Judith's control, messages from people who had never spoken up before, but who now saw an opportunity to break free, who now saw Nathan's departure as a turning point, as the first crack in the foundation of an empire they had always assumed was unshakable. By the time Leo came down the stairs, still dressed in his pajamas, his hair slightly tousled from sleep, the exhaustion in his small frame was evident, his steps slower than usual, his expression wary as if unsure of what the morning would bring. He hesitated for a moment in the doorway, his gaze flickering between me and Nathan, his fingers tugging at the hem of his shirt, the silent question in his eyes more painful than anything he could have said aloud. I set my coffee down on the counter, forcing a soft smile as I walked toward him, wrapping my arms around his small frame, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of his head as I whispered, "We're okay, sweetheart. Everything is going to be okay." He didn't say anything at first, just leaned into the warmth of my embrace, his arms wrapping tightly around my waist, the weight of his trust settling deep in my chest, grounding me in a way that nothing else could. Nathan closed his laptop with a quiet click, rubbing a hand over his face before pushing himself up from the table, his exhaustion evident in the tightness of his shoulders, in the deep furrow between his brows, in the quiet exhale that left his lips before he turned to look at us. "I need to make a few calls today," he said, his voice softer than usual, his tone carrying an edge of finality, of quiet determination, of something heavier than anger but steadier than grief. "Some of my clients are already reaching out, asking what's next, asking if I'm planning to start something on my own. I think it's time I give them an answer." The weight of his words settled over the room, a shift so subtle, yet so significant that I felt it in the very air around us, in the unspoken understanding that passed between us in that moment. Judith had spent years controlling him, dictating every step of his career, ensuring that his future was always tied to hers, that his success would always be something she could claim as her own. But now, for the first time since he had been old enough to take his place within the company, he was making a choice that had nothing to do with her, nothing to do with the Turner name, nothing to do with the expectations that had been forced upon him. Leo finally pulled back from my embrace, his gaze shifting toward Nathan, his small voice breaking the silence with a question that held more weight than he likely realized. "Does this mean we don't have to see Grandma anymore?" The simplicity of his words, the quiet hope laced beneath them, made something in my chest tighten, made something in my throat constrict, made something in me ache in a way that was impossible to ignore. Nathan crouched down in front of him, meeting him at eye level, his expression gentle but unwavering as he reached out to place a steadying hand on his shoulder, the conviction in his voice leaving no room for doubt. "We don't have to see anyone who doesn't treat us with love and respect. Family isn't about blood, Leo. It's about the people who choose to stand beside you no matter what." The relief in Leo's expression was immediate, his small body relaxing for the first time since the night before, his shoulders no longer hunched, the tension no longer weighing him down, the quiet fear that had lingered in his gaze finally beginning to fade. He nodded once, the movement small but certain, then turned toward the kitchen, his footsteps lighter now, his posture less burdened, his presence no longer carrying the heaviness of unspoken hurt. I watched him for a moment, my heart aching with the knowledge that he had been forced to learn such a painful lesson at such a young age, that he had been made to understand cruelty in a way no child ever should. But I also knew, with unwavering certainty, that he would never have to face it again, that he would never have to question whether or not he was wanted, that he would never have to fight for a place where he truly belonged. Nathan pushed himself up from the floor, his gaze meeting mine across the room, the silent promise in his eyes stronger than anything words could convey, the shared understanding between us unbreakable in its certainty. "I'm going to build something new," he said, his voice quiet but steady, his conviction unshaken, his decision already made. "And this time, I'm going to build it on my own terms." I nodded once, my chest swelling with something that felt an awful lot like hope, something that felt an awful lot like freedom, something that felt an awful lot like the beginning of a life that was finally ours.